The tow tractor already had its chains hooked to the nose gear when Della Wren came back out of the maintenance hangar with a coffee in one hand and a torque wrench in the other. She had been gone 4 minutes. For minutes inside a building she had every right to be in, on a ramp her late husband had helped pour the concrete for, on a morning she had no reason to think would be different from any other. The young man driving the tractor wasn't looking at her. He kept his eyes on the steel cable and the slow, careful angle of the turn, the way a person looks at their hands when they've been told to do something they suspect is wrong. The man in the pressed slate-gray suit, the one who had given the order, didn't look at her at all. He had already turned back toward the new glass terminal annex, phone against his ear, heels clicking on fresh-poured walkway, moving on to the next item on a list that did not have her name anywhere near the top of it. What he didn't know, what nobody standing on that ramp that morning knew, was that the dusty silver airplane being dragged across the tarmac like scrap was worth more than the entire fleet of business jets parked in his shiny new row. What he didn't know was that the woman in the oil-stained coveralls, the one he had just called a squatter in front of a dozen people, had once held an altitude record that still stood. And what he absolutely did not know, what would empty the blood out of his face in about 36 hours, was that the famous captain headlining the airfield's anniversary celebration, the man whose face was on the banner hanging across the terminal, would step off his airplane, walk past the senator, past the cameras, past the line of executives with their hands already extended, and go straight to her. He would stop in front of the grease-stained single mom. He would come to attention, and in front of everyone who had laughed that morning, he would say 4 words that turned the whole story inside out. But that was 36 hours away. On this morning, all Della Wren had was a cooling coffee, a wrench she no longer needed, and the long, level patience of a woman who had decided a long time ago that the world's small cruelties weren't worth the fuel it took to burn over them. The morning had started the way most of her mornings started, with a 7-year-old who could not, under any circumstances, locate his shoes. Sam Wren announced the crisis from his bedroom, then from the hallway, then from a position roughly 8 inches from Della's left ear while she stood at the counter turning 2 eggs into something that could pass for breakfast. The shoes were under the couch. They were always under the couch. He knew it and she knew it, and the search was less about the shoes than about the ceremony of the morning, the small, reliable theater of a kid who needed to know the day would hold together the way it always did. She found them, handed them over, and got a hug that smelled like cereal and grass stains. Then came the second crisis, delivered in the grave tone he reserved for matters of state. "Did you sign the thing for the field trip?" "Signed it last night. The museum one. The airplanes one. That's the one I signed." He considered her with the narrow, professional suspicion of a small auditor, decided the books were clean, and went to put his shoes on the correct feet on the second attempt. In his other hand, the way it always was when he was nervous or excited or simply awake, he held the little wooden airplane. It was no bigger than his palm, a stubby silver thing carved out of poplar, the propeller hand-painted, one wingtip worn smooth from 3 years of being held. Tom had made it for him at the workbench in the back of the hangar, the winter before everything changed. Sam did not know that the man who made it could no longer be asked questions. He only knew that the plane was his, that it flew best when held out a car window at speed, and that it was not, ever, under any circumstance, to be left at home. They drove to school in the truck, a 1989 Ford the color of a faded barn, a vehicle that required a particular sequence of coaxing to get the driver's window to seal in the cold. Della knew every rattle in it, every hesitation in the engine on the hill by the reservoir. People had told her for years to replace it. She told them the same thing she told Sam, that machines with character were worth keeping, that you didn't throw away a thing just because it had earned a few scars. Sam had once repeated this to his teacher as a fact about life, which was how Della learned that her son was listening more than he let on. At the drop-off loop, she kissed the top of his head through the window. He made her promise she'd be there for pickup. She promised. He vanished into the river of small bodies pouring through the double doors, backpack bouncing, the wooden plane tucked away somewhere safe, and Della sat for 1 extra minute in the idling truck and let herself feel the particular warmth of having been somebody's whole morning. Then she pulled out of the loop and drove the 9 miles of county road to Larkspur Field, where the rest of her life waited under a canvas tarp in the back of a hangar. Larkspur Field was not a famous airport. It was a single asphalt runway and a cluster of hangars on the flat green land east of town, the kind of place that smelled like cut grass and avgas and the inside of a toolbox warmed by the sun. Tom's father had been one of the men who built it in 1958, a returning aviator with a war's worth of flying in him and nowhere civilized to put it. They had pooled money, poured concrete, raised the hangars themselves, and signed a charter that hung framed in the pilot's lounge, a yellow document with a clause in it that, 67 years later, would matter more than any of them could have guessed. For most of the people who used Larkspur, it was a refuge. Crop dusters and weekend flyers, a flight school that ran 2 beaten Cessnas, a handful of old men who came mostly to drink coffee and argue about magnetos. And in the far hangar, the one with the good light, Della Wren's airplane. She pulled the tarp off it the way you'd pull a sheet off something sleeping, careful and unhurried. And there it was, a North American P-51 Mustang, polished down to bare metal, the aluminum so bright in the morning sun that it threw light across the hangar walls. The fuselage was long and lean and predatory, the canopy a clean bubble of glass, the 4 blades of the propeller standing motionless against the open door like a thing waiting to be asked. On the cowl, in modest script Tom had painted himself, was a single word: halcyon. It did not look like junk. To anyone who knew airplanes, it looked like a religious experience. 11 years ago it had 1 grand champion at the largest fly-in on the continent, a golden wrench, a judge's award, the works. After Tom and Della spent 6 winters rebuilding it from a corroded hulk a rancher had been using as a chicken coop. They had found it in pieces, missing an engine, the skin pocked with rust, and they had brought it back rivet by rivet, the way you bring back anything you refuse to give up on. It was insured for a number that would have made the man in the gray suit choke on his espresso. And this week, for the first time in 4 years, Della had pulled the cowling and started the slow, reverent work of bringing it back to airworthy. The annual celebration was coming. The field's anniversary. She had decided, quietly, without announcing it to anyone, including herself, that halcyon would fly again. She had her head halfway into the engine bay, cowling off, the silver flanks open like a patient on a table, when the cars arrived. There were 3 of them, and they parked in a row outside the new annex with the careful, synchronized confidence of people who had practiced arriving places. Della knew without straightening up that they weren't pilots. Pilots drove pickups and beaters and the occasional motorcycle. These were lease cars, German, identical except for color, and the men and women who got out of them moved across the ramp in business shoes that had never met a puddle of hydraulic fluid in their lives. The man in front was somewhere around 40, lean, expensively barbered, with the kind of tan that comes from a schedule rather than a job. His name was Dane Whitfield, and he was the new director of operations for Crestmont Aviation Holdings, the company that had, 6 weeks earlier, won the management contract for Larkspur Field. Most of the people who flew out of Larkspur had only the dimmest idea what that meant. They would learn. Whitfield was giving a tour. Della could hear the shape of it before she could hear the words, the rising, confident cadence of a man selling a vision to people who'd already bought it. He gestured at the new jet row, at the half-finished glass annex, at the surveyor's stakes that had appeared along the old grass parking like teeth coming in. The words premium destination and clientele and experience drifted across the ramp. Then the tour reached the heritage hangars and the words stopped. Della straightened up and wiped her hands on a rag and watched Dane Whitfield see her airplane for the first time. She watched his face do the thing that ignorant faces do when they look at something they don't have the vocabulary to understand. He saw an old airplane with its engine hanging open. He saw a tarp wadded on the ground and a toolbox and a woman in coveralls with grease to her elbows. He did not see $60,000 of polished aluminum or 11 years of trophies. He saw clutter. He saw a problem standing between him and the clean architectural rendering he had pinned to a board in his new office. "What is this?" he said. It wasn't a question. It was a verdict looking for someone to deliver it to. A younger man beside him. Clipboard, lanyard, the anxious posture of staff, said something quiet that Della couldn't hear. Whitfield's eyes moved from the airplane to her and back. "Whose is this?" "Mine." Della stepped out of the hangar's shadow into the light. "Della Wren. I keep a hangar here. Have for 16 years. Whitfield looked at her the way certain people look at whether they find inconvenient. He had a clipboard of his own now, taken from the anxious young man, and he made a small mark on it without breaking eye contact, a gesture designed to communicate that her existence had been noted and categorized. "We've got the anniversary event in 2 days," he said. "There's going to be press here. A senator. Captain Brandt's bringing the heritage flight through." He said the name Captain Brandt the way you drop a coin on a counter, expecting it to ring. "I need this ramp clean, showpiece clean, and this." He tipped his chin at Halcyon, at the open engine, at the most beautiful object within 100 miles. "This is the first thing anybody sees when they taxi in. It's an eyesore. I need it gone." There was a small crowd now. There was always a small crowd. A flight instructor and 2 students had drifted over from the Cessnas. Old Gus Pelham, the field's mechanic for 31 years, had come out of his shop wiping his hands and stood at the edge of the concrete with the still, attentive quality of a man who has seen trouble take many shapes and recognizes this one. A few of Crestmont's people stood in a loose arc behind Whitfield, and one of them, Della clocked it without wanting to, was smiling. "It's not an eyesore," Della said. Her voice was level. She had spent a lot of years learning to keep it level. "It's a 1944 Mustang. It's mid-annual. I'll have the cowling back on by Thursday and it'll be the best-looking airplane on your ramp. It's leaking oil onto my concrete. That's a drip pan. That's where oil's supposed to go." A flicker of irritation crossed his face, the irritation of a man unused to being corrected by people in coveralls. "Ms. Wren, I'm going to be straight with you, because I think you'll appreciate directness." He did not pause to find out whether she would. "Crestmont's investing 8 figures in this facility. We're building a destination. And destinations don't have—" He searched for the word, found the one he wanted, deployed it with relish. "Junk parked out front. I've got a tow tractor and I've got a contract that gives me operational authority over this ramp. So you can move it into storage, you can sell it for scrap, I don't much care. But it is not sitting on my showpiece ramp when that airplane lands Saturday." The word junk landed in the morning air and just sat there. Gus Pelham took a step forward, and Della caught his eye and gave him the smallest shake of her head. "Not yet. Not like this." He stopped. The smiling Crestmont employee stopped smiling, because something about the way the grease-stained woman held herself had begun to register as wrong with the picture. The way a sound you can't place will make you turn your head. Della looked at the airplane. She looked at the tow tractor the anxious young man had been told to fetch, idling now at the edge of the apron. She looked at Dane Whitfield, and she thought about a great many things she could say, and she said none of them. "You don't have the authority to move this aircraft," she said instead, quietly. "It's not abandoned property. It's airworthy in process and it's registered and insured and it sits in a hangar I lease under a charter that predates your company by 60 years. You touch it, you own the consequences." Whitfield smiled, and it was the smile of a man who had read his contract and believed it covered everything. "We'll see what the charter says," he said. "Hook it up," he told the kid on the tractor, and he turned, already on his phone, already gone, heels clicking, on to the next problem on the list. She did not yell. She did not record it on her phone, though 3 of Crestmont's people had theirs out. She walked over to the tow tractor and she said, calmly, to the kid driving it, his name tag read Marcus and he was maybe 19 and miserable, "Son, if you so much as scratch that paint, you'll be working the rest of your natural life to pay for it, and that's not a threat, that's just the number. So go slow." Marcus went very slow. Her phone buzzed in the chest pocket of her coveralls. She knew the ringtone, she'd assigned it to the school office. She answered, watching the chains go taut, watching the most precious physical object she owned begin to roll backward across the concrete under the direction of a man who'd called it garbage. "Mom!" Sam's voice, small and careful, which meant he was calling from the front office where the secretary could hear. "I forgot to give you the second form. Mrs. Atchison says you have to sign it by Friday or I can't go on the airplane trip. I'll sign it tonight, bud. Promise." "You sound funny." She watched Halcyon's tail come around. The morning light slid down the polished aluminum, and for a second the whole airplane was a single blade of fire, and Della Wren stood on the ramp her husband had helped build with a phone against her ear and a wrench she didn't need in her hand and did not let one note of it reach her voice. I'm fine, she said. Long morning. You go back to class. Pasta tonight. The one with the butter? The one with the butter. She hung up. She watched them tow her airplane into the dark mouth of the overflow hangar at the far end of the field, the one with the leaking roof and the bad light, and park it among the lawnmowers and the de-icing equipment like a racehorse stabled with goats. And then she went and found Gus Pelham, who was standing with his arms crossed and a look on his face like a thunderhead deciding which way to go. Don't, she said. Della, don't. Not today. There's a smarter way. You gonna tell me what it is? She looked across the field at the new glass annex catching the sun, at the surveyor's stakes marching across the old grass, at the banner with Captain Theo Brandt's face on it strung above the terminal door. She thought about the frame charter hanging in the pilot's lounge, the one nobody had read in years, the one with the clause her father-in-law had insisted on, the way a man insists on a thing he knows will matter long after he's gone. Not yet, she said, but soon. To understand why Dane Whitfield had just made the most expensive mistake of his career, you have to understand who he'd actually been talking to, and the truth was that almost nobody at Larkspur Field fully understood it anymore because Della Wren had spent 4 years making sure they didn't. She had not always been a woman in coveralls. There had been a version of her, 15 years gone now, who wore a flight suit with patches on it and a name tag that read Wren, and that name had once meant something to a very particular and very serious group of people. She had come up through aviation the unglamorous way. A kid from a nothing town with no money and a borrowed logbook, working line service at a county field to earn enough hours to keep flying. But she had a thing that money can't buy and schools can't teach, an instinct for the machine, for the air, for the invisible architecture of forces that a wing rides on. She felt airplanes the way some people feel music. She could tell you what was wrong with an engine by the way the seat felt under her, could feel a stall coming the way you feel a storm in your knee. By 24 she was a flight test engineer's secret weapon, the pilot they sent up when the data didn't make sense and they needed somebody who could fly the numbers and explain them on the ground. By 26 she had flown a heavily modified piston aircraft to an altitude record in her weight class that, as of that morning, still stood, a record set in thin, killing air at the edge of where wings work at all, a flight that 3 more experienced pilots had refused before they handed her the keys. People in that world knew her name. They said it the way you say the name of someone who does the thing everyone else only talks about. And then she met Tom Wren, who flew warbirds for a living and restored them for love, and the two halves of her life clicked together like a cowling onto an engine. They married at the field. They bought the corroded Mustang. They built Halcyon together over 6 winters, and they flew it to that Grand Champion trophy, and somewhere in there they had Sam, and for a while Della Wren had the rarest thing in the world, which was a life that fit her exactly. Then, for years ago, on a ferry flight she had begged off of because Sam had a fever, Tom went down in weather over a ridge 200 miles north, and the version of Della who wore the flight suit went into the ground with him. She didn't stop flying because she lost her nerve. She stopped because the calculus changed. There was a 3-year-old who had already lost half of everything, and there was a mother who had spent her whole life choosing the air over the ground, and the math wasn't complicated. She put the flight suit away. She kept the hangar because she couldn't bear to sell it and because the airplane was the last thing she and Tom had built with their 4 hands. She learned to keep the books for the flight school, to turn wrenches for Gus when he was shorthanded, to be the steady, unremarkable woman in coveralls who was always at pickup at 3:15. She read late at night after Sam was asleep. Flight test reports, accident dockets, the dense, beautiful mathematics of the thing, not because she needed to, but because the pattern still pleased her, the way music pleases someone who has stopped performing but never stopped hearing it. So when Dane Whitfield looked at her airplane and said junk, he was not insulting a hobbyist. He was standing in front of a national record holder, telling her that the masterpiece she and her dead husband had built with their own hands was an eyesore cluttering up his ramp. He just didn't know it. Nobody had told him because he hadn't asked. He had looked at a truck and a pair of coveralls and a grease stain, and he had filed the whole human being under a heading he'd written before he'd ever laid eyes on her. It was, Della would reflect later, an extremely common mistake. It was just rarely this expensive. What Dane Whitfield was actually doing at Larkspur Field had very little to do with showpiece ramps, and Della had begun to suspect as much 3 weeks before he ever called her airplane junk. Crestmont Aviation Holdings did not win management contracts for Sleepy County airfields because it loved general aviation. Crestmont won them because there was money in conversion, in taking a public charter field with cheap land and a single runway and turning it into a private jet center for the kind of clientele that paid by the month for a hangar slot. The plan, which existed as a glossy rendering on a board in Whitfield's office and as a financial model on a server Della would never see, was to clear the old heritage hangars, repave the heritage ramp, and lease the whole eastern end of the field to a fractional jet operator who'd been waiting in the wings. There was exactly one problem, and its name was the charter. When the founders built Larkspur in 1958, Tom's father had insisted on a clause that the others thought was sentimental and he understood to be load-bearing. The Founders' Covenant. It said, in the careful legal English of a man who had watched too many things get bulldozed in the name of progress, that the heritage ramp and the founders' hangars could not be repurposed, leased to commercial operators, or demolished without the written consent of every surviving founder or, in the event of a founder's death, that founder's designated heir. It was the kind of clause that lawyers groan at because it gives a single person a veto over a multimillion-dollar plan. It was, in other words, exactly what it had been written to be. And there was exactly one surviving founder's heir who held a hangar on that ramp. Tom Wren had been the last of the founding families to keep flying out of Larkspur. When he died, his stake and his veto passed to his widow. Dane Whitfield needed Della Wren's signature. And Della Wren, who had read that charter the way she read everything slowly and twice, had no intention of giving it. So the pressure had started small and gotten less small. A letter informing her that her hangar lease was under review for compliance. An inspection that found 3 violations on an airplane that had passed the same inspection for a decade. An appraisal, commissioned by Crestmont, conducted by an appraiser Della would later learn had done 4 other jobs for the same fractional jet operator, that valued the heritage aircraft on the field at salvage rates and described them in writing as non-airworthy legacy airframes of negligible market value. That word again dressed up in a suit. Junk. They needed the airplanes to be worthless on paper because worthless things are easy to clear, and clearing them was the whole game. Della had watched it assemble itself with the cold, clear attention she'd once used to watch an airspeed needle in thin air. She knew what it was. She knew where it was going. And she had decided, the way she decided most things, without drama and without telling anyone, that she was going to let Dane Whitfield build his whole beautiful house on a foundation she already knew was rotten, and then she was going to let it fall on him. She just hadn't expected the demolition to arrive in the form of an airplane landing out of a clear Saturday sky. The anniversary celebration had been planned for a year, back before Crestmont, by the people who actually loved the field. 75 years of Larkspur. There would be a pancake breakfast and a static display and the flight school's 2 Cessnas giving rides to kids, and the centerpiece, the thing that had gotten a senator and 3 TV stations to put it on their calendars, was the heritage flight. Captain Theo Brandt was, by any measure, the most famous pilot alive who wasn't an astronaut. He had started as an Air Force fighter pilot, become a commercial captain, and then become something rarer, a celebrity of the air, the man networks called when an airliner did something impossible and lived, the face of a streaming documentary about flight that 40 million people had watched. He flew restored warbirds at shows in his spare time the way other rich men collect watches, except that Brandt flew them beautifully, and used them to raise money for the children of pilots who hadn't come home. He had agreed to bring a small heritage formation to Larkspur's anniversary, to land, to speak, to shake the senator's hand and let the cameras roll. Crestmont had seized on it like a drowning man on a spar. Dane Whitfield had put the captain's face on a banner and his airplane in every press release and had begun, in his own mind, to treat Captain Brandt's visit as a personal endorsement of the Crestmont vision. Whitfield did not know, could not have known because it was not in any file he had access to, that there was a reason Captain Theo Brandt had said yes to a Sleepy County field in the middle of nowhere when he turned down 19 other invitations that month. He did not know that Brandt's people had specifically confirmed, twice, that the field in question was the Larkspur, the one east of town, the one that had been home to a particular aviator for the better part of 2 decades. He did not know that for 14 years, Captain Theo Brandt had kept a name in a place in his mind that he visited more often than he told anyone, and that the name was Wren. But all of that was still ahead. On Thursday, Della got the cowling back on Halcyon in the bad light of the overflow hangar, working alone past midnight, and she did not fly it, because Whitfield's people had taped a notice to the hangar door declaring the heritage ramp closed to all movement for the duration of the event. On Friday she signed Sam's second permission form and made the pasta with the butter and read him 3 chapters of a book about a girl who built her own glider. And on Saturday morning, before the sun was fully up, she put on a clean shirt instead of coveralls, took her son's hand, and drove to the field to watch a celebration that the men running it had not invited her to. By 10 o'clock the field had filled. There were cars parked in the grass for half a mile and kids on shoulders and the smell of pancakes and sunscreen. And along the front of the new glass annex a row of folding chairs held the people who mattered: the senator, the county commissioners, the regional manager who'd flown in from Crestmont's headquarters, and Dane Whitfield, who had bought a new suit for the occasion and kept touching his tie. The heritage ramp was, by his order, immaculate, swept, empty. The business jets had been repositioned into a clean diagonal row, noses out, like a luxury car dealership. Where Halcyon should have stood, would have stood, in the place of honor, on the 75th anniversary of the field her family helped build. There was nothing but a wide rectangle of bare concrete and a single orange cone. Della stood at the back of the crowd with Sam on a step stool so he could see, the wooden airplane clutched in his fist, and she did not say a word. Gus Pelham stood beside her with his arms crossed. A few of the old flyers had found their way to her, the way ships find each other in fog, and they stood in a loose knot at the edge of everything, the people who remembered. A little before 11, the radio in Gus's hand. He still carried one, out of habit and stubbornness. Crackled with a voice calling the field, a calm professional voice requesting a straight in for a flight of 3. And then somebody pointed at the southern sky, and the whole crowd turned at once, and over the tree line, low and tight and impossibly graceful, came 3 warbirds in formation. The lead a P-51 Mustang painted in olive drab, the throaty thunder of 3 Merlin engines rolling across the field a half-second behind them like the sound was trying to catch up. They broke overhead in a maneuver that pulled a sound out of the crowd, peeled into the pattern one by one, and came down onto Larkspur's single runway as smoothly as if they were being lowered on strings. The lead airplane taxied up the spotless heritage ramp, its engine settling from a roar to a loping, mechanical heartbeat, and swung its tail around and shut down on the exact rectangle of concrete where Halcyon should have been. The propeller ticked to a stop. The canopy slid back, and Dane Whitfield stood up from his folding chair, straightened his new tie, and walked out onto his showpiece ramp to greet the most famous pilot alive. It is worth slowing down here because what happened next happened fast, and the people who were there would spend a long time afterward trying to describe the exact moment the morning turned over. Captain Theo Brandt climbed down off the wing of his Mustang. He was lean and gray at the temples, and he moved with the unhurried economy of a man who had spent his life being watched and had stopped noticing. He pulled off his flight gloves. The senator was on his feet. The cameras were rolling. Dane Whitfield was walking toward him across the bright concrete with his hand already coming up, his face arranged into the warm, proprietary smile of a host, the regional manager a half-step behind him, and the whole machinery of the event leaned forward to capture the handshake that would be on every news cycle that night. Captain Brandt looked at Dane Whitfield's extended hand. He looked at the senator. He looked at the row of folding chairs and the banner with his own face on it and the immaculate empty ramp. And then he looked past all of it, past the suit and the smile and the cone, scanning the crowd at the back with the quick, level sweep of a man searching a field for a specific thing, the way a pilot scans a sky. He found her. He walked past Dane Whitfield's hand as if it weren't there. He walked past the senator. He walked off the edge of the heritage ramp and through the front rank of the crowd, which parted for him without understanding why, and he did not stop until he was standing in front of a woman in a clean shirt with a 7-year-old on a step stool beside her. The cameras swung to follow him, confused. Whitfield's hand was still hanging in the air over an empty patch of concrete. Captain Theodore Brandt stopped in front of Della Wren. And then, in front of the senator and the commissioners and 3 TV cameras and every single person who had laughed on the ramp 2 days before, the most famous pilot alive came to attention, the unmistakable straightening of a man who had worn a uniform, and he said the 4 words, "Commander Wren, my honor." The field went silent in the particular way a place goes silent when several hundred people simultaneously realize they have misread a situation. The pancakes kept their smell. The Merlin engines kept ticking as they cooled. But the human noise just stopped. Della looked at the captain for a long moment. Something moved across her face that she didn't entirely let the crowd see. A recognition, and under it something older and more painful, the past coming up out of the ground where she'd buried it. Sam looked up at the famous man who had walked across an entire airfield to talk to his mom, and then up at his mom, recalibrating his understanding of the universe in real time. "It's just Della now, Theo," she said quietly. "It's never going to be just anything to me," Brandt said. "You know that." And then, because he was the kind of man who understood that a debt paid in private is only half paid, he turned around. He turned to face the crowd, and the cameras, and the senator, and the suit with his hand finally lowering, and he raised his voice so that it carried across the whole stunned field. 14 years ago, Captain Brandt said, I was a 26-year-old idiot in a single-engine trainer who flew himself into a situation that should have killed him. Engine quit at altitude over country with nowhere to put down. I had about 4 minutes to live and I'd used up most of my good ideas. He paused. He was a storyteller. He knew the value of a pause. There was a test pilot flying a chase profile in the next sector who heard my call. She didn't have to do anything. It wasn't her airplane, wasn't her program, wasn't her problem. She broke off, came and found me, formed up on my wing, and she flew me down. Talked me through a dead stick glide to a dry lake bed I couldn't even see from where I was. Stayed on my wing the whole way down. I walked away from an airplane I had no business walking away from, and I have flown for 40 million miles since, and I have a wife and 2 daughters, and all of it, every mile, every one of them, exists because a pilot named Wren decided a stranger's life was worth breaking her flight plan for. He let that sit. Somewhere in the crowd, somebody started to clap and then stopped, unsure if it was the moment. I've spent 14 years trying to find a way to thank her, Brandt said. And she spent 14 years making it impossible, because she doesn't want to be thanked. She never did. So when I heard the field she flies out of was having its 75th, I said yes before they finished the sentence. He looked back at Della, and his voice came down out of the speech and into something simpler. I wanted to see your airplane, Wren. I wanted to see Halcyon. They told me it'd be on the ramp. He looked at the empty rectangle of concrete with the orange cone in the middle of it, and a small line appeared between his eyebrows. Where's your airplane? The silence changed temperature. Della didn't answer right away. She didn't have to. Old Gus Pelham, who had been holding it in for 2 days the way a man holds a door against a wind, said it for her, loud and flat and carrying. They towed it, Gus said, Tuesday, into the equipment shed with the lawnmowers. Mr. Whitfield there called it junk and had it dragged off the ramp so it wouldn't spoil the view. Every head on the field turned, slowly, like a field of sunflowers tracking a darker sun, toward Dane Whitfield, who was standing alone on his beautiful empty concrete in his new suit, and who had just discovered the precise and total cost of a verdict he'd delivered in 4 minutes about a woman he'd never bothered to ask a single question. There is a version of this story that ends right there with the public humiliation, and it would be satisfying enough. But Della Wren had not spent 2 days letting Dane Whitfield build his house just to enjoy watching one window break. She had read the charter. She knew the shape of the thing he was actually doing. And the anniversary of Larkspur Field happened to fall 4 days before the County Aviation Commission was scheduled to vote on Crestmont's conversion plan. The plan that would clear the heritage ramp, demolish the founders' hangars, and lease the eastern end of the field to a fractional jet operator. Whitfield had timed the celebration to build goodwill ahead of that vote. He had wanted the senator's photo and the captain's blessing in the record before the commissioners sat down. He got his photo. It was just not the one he'd planned. The commission met the following Wednesday in the county building downtown, in a room with bad fluorescent light and a long table and a public gallery that, for the first time in the commission's memory, was full. Word had traveled. The clip of Captain Brandt walking past Whitfield's hand to salute a woman in the crowd had been viewed several million times by Wednesday morning, and the question underneath it, who clears a national record holder's award-winning airplane off a ramp and calls it junk, had developed the kind of momentum that makes elected officials nervous. Dane Whitfield presented first. He was good at it. That was a thing Della would give him. He had slides. He spoke about investment and jobs and the future, about a tired old field and the bright destination it could become. He showed the rendering. He described the heritage aircraft carefully as a small number of legacy airframes that would be relocated to appropriate facilities. And he cited the appraisal, the one that called them junk in 7-syllable words, to argue that the cost of preserving them couldn't be justified to the taxpayer. He was building, slide by slide, the case that clearing the ramp was not vandalism but stewardship. Then it was the public's turn to speak, and Della Wren walked to the little podium with a folder under her arm. She did not raise her voice. She had never needed to. "My father-in-law helped build this field in 1958, she began. He flew 31 missions in a war and came home wanting nothing in the world except a place to keep flying, and he and 7 other men built one with their own hands. When they wrote the charter, he insisted on one clause that the others thought was sentimental. I'd like to read it into the record." She read the Founders' Covenant aloud, slowly, the way she read everything. The heritage ramp and the Founders' hangars could not be repurposed, leased to commercial operators, or demolished without the written consent of every surviving founder or that founder's designated heir. She let the language do its work, and she watched the faces of the commissioners do the arithmetic that Dane Whitfield had been hoping they'd never be asked to do. "I'm the designated heir of the last surviving founding family on that ramp," Della said. "And I do not consent. That's not a negotiating position. There's nothing to negotiate. The charter is recorded with the county. It's been recorded since 1958. Crestmont's plan requires my signature, and Crestmont's plan is not going to get my signature. And I think Mr. Whitfield has known that for 3 weeks, because it's the reason he's been trying so hard to make my airplane disappear." She opened the folder. "Because here's the thing about that appraisal he just cited. The one that says the heritage aircraft are non-airworthy legacy airframes of negligible market value." She set a piece of paper on the podium. "My airplane, the junk, is a 1944 P-51 Mustang that won Grand Champion at the largest fly-in on this continent 11 years ago. It is insured currently for $1.9 million, and that's conservative because the last comparable example sold at auction for $3.4. I have the policy. I have the auction record. I have the trophy, if anybody wants to see it. It's in my hangar next to the lawnmowers." A sound moved through the gallery that was not quite laughter. An appraiser who values that airplane at scrap is either incompetent or he's been told what number to write. So I did what Mr. Whitfield apparently assumed nobody at a sleepy county field would think to do. I looked the appraiser up. She set down a second sheet. "He's done 4 other valuations in the last 2 years. All 4 were for the same fractional jet operator that's set to lease this ramp the day after you approve the conversion. The same operator that, according to Crestmont's own filing, would pay Crestmont a relocation incentive structured around square footage cleared. The cheaper the airplanes are on paper, the easier they are to clear, and the more square footage gets cleared, the more Crestmont gets paid. The appraisal isn't a valuation. It's a tool. It was written to make a masterpiece look like trash so that clearing it would look like good stewardship instead of what it actually is, which is a private company using a public asset to manufacture its own payday." The room was very quiet. Dane Whitfield had stopped touching his tie. "I'm not against the future," Della said, and her voice gentled, because she had made her point and she was not a cruel woman. "I think the new annex is fine. I think more business at this field is good. I flew test profiles for a living. I'm not sentimental about progress. But you don't get to bulldoze the thing 8 men built with their hands and call it stewardship, and you don't get to look at a person in coveralls and decide you already know everything worth knowing about them, and you don't ever get to call somebody's life's work junk just because you didn't take the 4 seconds it would have cost you to ask a single question." She closed the folder. "That's all I came to say." The commission tabled the conversion plan that night, pending an independent review of the appraisal, and an independent review of an appraisal that crooked tends to end in exactly one way. Within a month, Crestmont had quietly withdrawn the conversion proposal entirely. Within 2, the company had restructured its management contract to a maintenance-only role and replaced its director of operations, and Dane Whitfield's name stopped appearing on Larkspur's letterhead and started appearing, briefly, in a trade press article about appraisal fraud that he is unlikely to have framed. None of it was loud. That was the part Della appreciated most. There was no company-wide email, no press conference, no triumphant speech. There was a vote tabled in a fluorescent-lit room, and then a series of quiet legal and corporate motions that unwound the thing the way you unwind a knot, patiently from the right end. The heritage ramp stayed. The founders' hangars stayed. The surveyor's stakes came out of the grass one afternoon, pulled by a county crew, and nobody made a ceremony of it. The field itself changed in small ways. The commission, embarrassed and motivated in the way that embarrassment motivates, voted to designate the heritage ramp a protected aviation landmark and to establish a modest fund for the upkeep of the founding hangars. Somebody proposed renaming the field, and Della asked them not to because Tom would have hated it, but a small bronze plaque went up by the door of the far hangar with the names of the 8 men who built the place in 1958, and Tom's father's name was on it, and the first time Sam read it out loud, finger moving under the letters, was a thing Della kept. And Halcyon came back out of the equipment shed into the good light, and Della Wren finished the annual she'd started. And on a clear morning in October, for the first time in 4 years, she flew it. She did not make an event of it. She didn't tell the press who'd have come. She told Gus because he'd have been hurt otherwise, and she told Sam because the whole point was Sam. It was a Saturday, cold and bright. The kind of fall morning that announces itself with frost on the windshield and wood smoke in the air. She pulled Halcyon out onto the heritage ramp at dawn, into the exact rectangle of concrete that had stood empty under an orange cone 2 months before, and she walked around it the way she'd walked around 100 airplanes, slow and unhurried, touching the leading edges, the control surfaces, the 4 blades of the propeller, the way you greet something you love that you've been afraid to lose. Sam stood at the edge of the ramp in a coat that was a size too big, holding the little wooden airplane Tom had carved, and beside him stood Captain Theo Brandt, who had stayed in touch since the anniversary and who had driven 4 hours to be there for this and had not told anyone he was coming. The two of them watched her climb up onto the wing and swing a leg into the cockpit and disappear under the canopy, and the bare aluminum threw the dawn light back at them so hard they had to squint. The Merlin engine caught on the 3rd blade with a cough and a snarl, and then a sound like the sky tearing politely, 12 cylinders and 1,200 horses settling into a loping, impossible idle, and Sam Wren felt it in his chest the way you feel the bass at a concert, the way you feel a thing that is too big for your body, and he held the wooden airplane very tightly and did not look away. She taxied out. She ran the engine up at the end of the runway, checked the magnetos, did all the small careful things in the right order. And then she rolled onto the center line of the single asphalt runway her family had poured, pushed the throttle forward, and the most beautiful airplane within 100 miles gathered itself and unstuck and climbed away into the cold bright morning, banking once over the field in a long, easy turn so that the rising sun ran the whole length of the polished fuselage like a struck match, and somewhere up there, for 9 minutes, Della Wren was the version of herself who wore the flight suit, and the air held her the way it always had, like it had been waiting. When she landed and shut down and slid the canopy back, Sam was already running across the ramp toward the airplane. The wooden plane held out in front of him at arm's length, flying it through the cold air at full speed the way it was meant to be flown, and Brandt was walking behind him with his hands in his pockets and a look on his face that Della would think about for a long time afterward. Not the famous captain's face, but the face of the scared 26-year-old who'd gotten to grow. "You still fly it like you stole it," Brandt called up to her. "I fly it like I built it," she said, and climbed down off the wing. Sam reached her and she caught him, and he wanted to know everything at once. How high, how fast, could he go next time, could the wooden plane go next time? And over his head she looked at Theo Brandt standing in the dawn light on the ramp her husband's father had built, and at the bronze plaque by the hangar door, and at the empty surveyor holes already filling with grass, and she felt something she hadn't let herself feel in 4 years, which wasn't happiness exactly, but was the thing. Happiness is built out of the quiet structural certainty that the ground under her was hers and was going to hold. "Next time," she told Sam. "You and the plane both. I promise." He considered this with the grave professional attention of a small auditor, found the books clean, and tucked the wooden airplane back into his coat where it lived. Brandt laughed at something, and Gus came out of his shop with 3 cups of coffee, and the cold sun climbed, and the field smelled like avgas and frost and wood smoke, and the most expensive mistake Dane Whitfield ever made stood gleaming on the heritage ramp where it belonged, and nobody, anywhere, was calling it junk. The lesson, if a person wanted one, was the same one Della had been saying to her son for years without either of them quite naming it. You don't throw a thing away because it's got a few scars on it. You don't read a person by their truck or their coveralls or where they happen to be standing when you walk in. And you never, ever assume you already know what you're looking at, because the quiet woman with grease on her hands might just be the one who touched the edge of the sky, and the old airplane under the tarp might be worth more than everything you arrived in, and the only way to find out is to do the one thing the powerful so often can't be bothered to do. If this story moved you, if you believe the quiet ones are usually carrying more than they let on, and that the world owes its better moments to the people who break their own flight plans for a stranger, do me a favor. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments about a time someone underestimated you and lived to learn better. Stick around. There's another one coming, and you're going to want to see how it ends.